Hello and welcome to episode 33 of The Garden Log with me, Ben Dark. I am a gardener and today I am broadcasting from the Dust Bowl of South East England. Here in the Thames Valley it has not rained for months. The vultures circle overhead, the hot pavements are littered with the bodies of exhausted commuters. Plants are suffering and gardeners are suffering. The lawns that we base so many of our gardens around are now just distant memories, like some sort of sweet treat that you remember from childhood and that was discontinued years and years ago. The whole thing is a wonderful advert for clover, not the butter, the plant. The clover-filled patches of the lawns are still green. And it's very interesting because it's not just the clover leaves that are green. The blades of grass that grow between those little tri-lobed leaves are also green. And this must be due to the breaking up of a heat island effect that happens in the main hard, dry lawn. Perhaps the clover's transpiration keeps the grass a bit cooler. Perhaps the deeper roots they have draw more water to the surface that the grass can use. Perhaps the grass is stronger because clover is a leguminous plant that fixes nitrogen in the soil around it, that makes nitrogen available for all of the other plants. Anyway, it's a wonderful, wonderful advert for not having a monocultural lawn, for letting clover in to ramp and creep around the place. I think I was reading something about the history of lawns, and I believe until the 1950s, when you bought a grass seed mix, you would always have a high proportion of clover. The American lawn, the original bastion of lawns, was designed to be sowed 2 parts clover, 1 part grass, I think, 1 part bent grass, because that was creating the velvety texture for people to walk on. I suppose the theory was that before the invention of selective herbicides, you were always going to get whacking great broad-leaved weeds growing in your grass. Better to crowd them out with a delicate and dainty clover than invite them all in. So perhaps this parching period will have some positives and will encourage people back towards the clover lawn. The nature of the heat this week meant that most of the gardening tasks were heat-related. They were running around performing triage on various bits of the garden, seeing which plants were closest to death and in need of urgent drenching, and which plants could be left for another couple of days. Though fans of sweat and curse words will be pleased to know that I still found a little bit of time for some back-breaking physical labour. And that's something that we will hear all about in the Week in Gardening, along with an interesting new vine that I'm trying out, that I'm trying to grow up some larch stems, some planting of some classic Nepeta, and a little bit of a philosophy on weeding. That's all for your listening pleasure in the Week in Gardening. Let's have a listen. Welcome to the Week in Gardening. The week started wetly with watering cans and watering wands. A watering wand is one of those hose nozzles that is on the end of a long rigid stick. It's very useful for pushing into bits of the border that you wouldn't reach from the edge and watering around the base of plants. And this helps to ensure that all of the water gets down into the soil, so you don't lose lots of it to evaporation as it slowly drips off the hot leaves. And it also means that you don't risk snapping blooms and fragile stems by giving them an unnatural load of water all at once where they're not used to it. I have to say that this long period of dryness is very good for some plants in the border, plants that are prone to snapping, we have some monstrous, almost genetically modified looking delphiniums that grow to about 11 foot tall. Vast blue flower spikes. But they're very, very prone to getting wet and are being unable to carry their own weight. Like those fabled monstrous battery chickens that can't support themselves on their legs. These things have been bred into absurdity. A watering wand is also very useful for doing things like hanging baskets. It means that you're not hoisting a watering can over your head and getting unnecessary workouts in. One tip that I have been teaching myself this week is not to use water from a hose that has been lying for a long time, basking in the sunlight like an unnaturally long snake. If you've left a hose out across a lawn, particularly a dark coloured hose, then it's still full of water, and that hose pipe is going to absorb vast amounts of solar radiation. And then when you turn the nozzle on, all of that superheated water comes rushing out, ready to boil your plants where they stand. Most of the plants got through the incredibly hot weekend without collapsing into little floppy balls of tissue paper. The few of the fuchsias in the hanging baskets, the trailing fuchsias, were looking decidedly past it. But that's what fuchsias do. They're the canary in the coal mine of the hanging basket world. They're always going to be the one that starts looking bad before the petunias and the lobelias and the rest of them. So I gave them loads and loads of water, and what I'll do is I'll keep an eye on them over the next few days, and if the mature leaves remain hanging limp and floppy like the sails on a becalmed ship, then I will cut them off and go back to some new bud points, which it will happily shoot from again, because I'm certain I caught it before it was all going to be dead. It's quite a maddening but fun game, keeping alive the amount of baskets and urns and planters that we have going in the garden this year. It feels like you're spinning plates as you rush from one to the other, and none of them are allowed to drop and die off. Or maybe you're playing that early 90s computer game, Lemmings, where you have a load of pixelated lemmings and they're desperate to get themselves killed, and you, as their god, have to stop them from dying. So far, so benevolent from me. We will see how it goes. So on Monday I went home with all the plants sufficiently hydrated and rose again to work on Tuesday. And on Tuesday I went to break rocks in the hot sun. I was finishing off the edge of a rockery. The real work had been done by some professional landscaper type people. They had built a retaining wall out of breeze blocks and done some clever stuff to attach rocks and soil to it to make the whole thing look like it had been scattered there by some glacial incident in ice ages past. But there was a little corner that needed rounding off and stacking up and planting. I haven't planted it yet, but I've built it, which was a horrendously hard job. The wheelbarrow and sack barrow could only get the rocks so far. The last bit, they had to be hauled up into the cradle of my arms while I staggered forward like a contestant from The World's Strongest Man and dropped them down. They are in place now, and I'll go and get some alpines to plant there. I did do some planting in that area of the garden, though, on Tuesday. And the area of the garden it's an odd one. I've referred to it before. It's where I'm creating this tropical garden, where I'm going to put lots of broad-leaved things and foliage plants. And there are a load of strange, old, semi-dead larches growing that we can't remove. The larch trees that grow there have suffered significant hardship over the year. Most of them have lost their tops, which is unfortunate because the larch doesn't have a great deal going for it if you're not in the softwood industry. But one of the things that's nice about it is the shape of the mature tree. But when they've been topped off like this, then they don't even have that. They just have an expanse of very scruffy looking trunk and needles knocking about the place, and a tendency to drop cones that kill sections of the lawn if they're not picked up. And I came across this wonderful new plant that I'm going to try and grow up these bare stems. It's called Schizophragma. And the one that I've planted is Schizophragma integrifolium, which is also called the Chinese hydrangea vine. And you can see why. I think that hydrangea fans might argue that, well, surely the climbing hydrangea is the hydrangea vine. And looking at this Schizophragma, they would say, well, that is pretty climbing hydrangea-like. They're certainly related. They've got those same aerial roots, the little bit like ivy roots that stick them onto the trunk of the tree. But these have hydrangea-like flower heads, but the flower heads are bigger, and they're surrounded by those sterile petals. And the sterile petals are a beautiful white teardrop shape. And I've seen pictures of these vines clothing these trunks of trees up to 6 meters. So vast heights. And I'm hoping that these, with their dark green, very serrated leaves that apparently turn yellow in the winter, will form columns of white in years to come up these trees in midsummer. And that what was a slightly strange, unsettling aspect of the garden would become one of its strongest features. I should say the larches, the reason we can't take them out is because they were cunningly put in there when this part of land was, I think, at risk of development. And there is a belt of them, and they have a TPO on them, so they can't be removed without the permission from the tree department of the council. I'll keep you updated on how they go, and I'm very excited for the moment when I see them start clinging by themselves, the moment they're just leaning, hopefully, against the larch stems. So that was Tuesday. It was a sweaty day, but one that saw the satisfaction of completing a couple of little jobs. On Wednesday, I tackled one of the borders, one of my favourite borders, the border that I dedicated the entirety of episode 7 to talking about. That's the one episode that doesn't follow this format that I stumbled upon in the first broadcast. And it's a special one-off flower bed edition. Anyway, that border was starting to look rather ragged because all of the Cycads had finished flowering, and those very, very heavy flower stalks were getting heavier as they set the seed, which will no doubt go all over the garden. And so the flower stems were falling over and laying on top of other bits and pieces. So I cut them all back. And for that, the border looks a lot better. It looks fresher. It looks like I've taken a month or even a month and a half off its age. Suddenly it looks more spring-like and fresh again than midsummer and tired. Partly that's because Cycads, when the flower spikes die, they put a lot of black and brown onto the seed heads. And that colour, you don't really notice until it's gone how it drags down a border like the one that I am dealing with. I also pulled out a lot of plants that I'd grown from seed and put in only this year, and that was a blue bacopa. I grew loads and loads of bacopa from seed, and I grew only one variety because that's the only seed I could get for some reason, and that was Bluetopia, which has a little violet coloured flower. And unfortunately, I found it a really disappointing plant, which hurt me personally because me and bacopa have a long history. It's one of the plants that I first started using when I was doing my first actual paid gardening jobs. In London, I would cycle down to the Covent Garden flower market when it opened, and you can buy perennials there. And I bought bacopa and I'd use it to fill in gaps in borders. Then I was using the salmon pink variety, and I've done it many times since using the white one, Snowtopia, which is very, very good. I put it underneath things like cornices, the wedding cake tree. It looks wonderful around black grass, so that the actual black grey blades show up against it. And I thought this time I would use the blue bacopa, but it just looked very, very weedy. Something about the flowers themselves didn't look particularly intentional, and the form it had was much more spidery in its spreading. It spread in long branch lines rather than in a little dense mat as other bacopa sometimes does. And I had been giving it a stay of execution for a while, but by this day, by Wednesday, I'd had enough and I've pulled it all out. And unfortunately, the bare soil looks better than the place where there were plants before. So a damning indictment of Bacopa Blutopia. I also did some weeding in another flower bed, in a more shady flower bed. I've decided to leave in all of the herb robert, the little tiny wild geranium weed this year. I'm thinking it's like the philosophy of tidying. I think just one type of weed left in a flower bed could look quite nice and intentional. If you think of it as the equivalent of when someone comes round to your house and there is one book, one carefully chosen book, one book by a playful intellectual left out on the table, and one glass with the residue of a particularly fine red wine in it. That doesn't look messy and slovenly in the same way as having the table covered in 15 tea mugs and empty Kit Kat wrappers does. And I'm hoping that leaving just one type of weed in some of the flower beds will look like it was a design choice, which it is essentially. I just don't want to say that, rather than having 15 different types all growing next to each other. So I'm going to see how that weed bed develops, and if anyone notices, I'm sure they will, but probably they'll be too polite to say anything to me. They'll just think, oh, that poor chap, he never learned about that weed in horticultural college. On Thursday I did some more planting. I don't know if I'm the only one planting in this heat still. I can't be. There's going to be a massive rush though in the autumn. If you work in a nursery, then I don't think you should book any time off for September. As soon as it cools down, everyone is going to rush out and plant all of those things that they put off during the heat wave. I was planting very drought-tolerant plants. I was planting Nepeta, and I was planting everyone's favourite Nepeta, Six Hills Giant. If that is not your favourite Nepeta, if you are more of a Walker's Low or a Kit Kat man, then you can, of course, get in touch. But I like Six Hills Giant because it is giant and big and reliable and utterly covered in flowers. It spreads quickly. It doesn't seem to be the sufferer of many diseases. It doesn't get squashed by cats particularly easily as well. And I was putting that into the flower bed where I planted the big standard wisteria and the roses, the white rose, Kew Gardens. And I have to say I'm incredibly happy with Kew Gardens as a rose. It's been in flower now for about a month. It doesn't show any sign of stopping. It opens, the single flowers open a lovely warm yellow and then fade to white as they age. The leaves look incredibly healthy, glossy green, unbitten by leaf cutters or any other pest. It might be because this bed is new to roses and new to cultivation generally, and all of the pests and diseases haven't had time to build up in the soil and to find the roses yet. But for the time being, they are very happy plants. Friday I spent getting the garden ready for the weekend, deadheading. I spoke about that last week as one of my favourite jobs. There are vast amounts of pollen beetles out and about. Pollen beetles are those tiny little black beetles that you see, particularly I see them a lot on orange flowers. I don't know if they just show up more clearly on orange flowers, but they're little black things. You get them when you cut bunches of sweet peas and take them inside, and all of the pollen beetles decide to go and wander across the kitchen table and end up in the butter. So lots of pollen beetles about. I keep having brilliant ideas on Fridays, and it's particularly bad this time of year because it's really too hot to move plants around, but I keep having epiphanies and realising that really this plant should be there and that one should be moved there and this other one should be split into 4 pieces and the 4 pieces sent off to the 4 corners of the garden, like parts of a heretical traitor in Catholic England. And it's unfortunate because it's not the time to be doing any of that stuff, and by the autumn I will have had a whole new set of ideas and I will have forgotten about these. I need to get my notebook back out and start writing a long list of move the ajuga to the front of the island bed. One thing that I was able to move was a big cycad in a pot. You know, cycads are those wonderfully prehistoric dinosaur-looking plants, like a spiky calm that actually draws blood when you poke your finger onto the spikes. I managed to jam my thumb onto the central growth point. I was checking like you might a tree fern, where you go and stick your hand in the middle and feel if there's emerging fronds. And I just wanted to feel what it was like down there, what the growing point of the plant was up to in terms of textures. So I stuck my thumb down there and impaled it on this needle-like structure at the heart of the plant, which serves me right. Anyway, I moved one of those in a pot to stand in the position in the middle of one of the borders, because there was a gap left by some flopping geraniums that had been cut back. And it's magnificent the way it transforms an entire border. Now suddenly there is a bit more vigour, a bit more bite, a bit more energy to the area. It looks like it's got attitude, whereas before it was perfectly nice and lovely and floppy. And just one plant has done that to actually quite a large section of planting. So I'm very pleased, and I shall have to think more about buying some good specimens that can be kept under glass in the winter and then moved out to their positions in the summertime. And with that, it was the end of the week. I finished by having a beer, sitting in the garden, looking out at all I had done, and feeling very pleased with myself. Hopefully you are all feeling very pleased with what you have done in the gardens this week. If you're not feeling very pleased, then maybe some horticultural recommendations will cheer you up. My recommendation this week is Head Gardeners by Ambra Edwards, with photographs by Charlie Hopkinson. It's a book that I had been meaning to read for some time, ever since it came out in 2017. I thought, that's just my kind of a thing. It's essentially a loving portrait of a group of head gardeners. I think there are 14 of them in total, from a variety of different backgrounds, managing a variety of different gardens. And Ambra very skillfully tells the stories of the gardeners and the gardens they work in, how they came to be in their position, their philosophy, and the different skills that they hold. I am a head gardener myself, so obviously I was personally flattered by the introduction, which is a great hagiographic review of what qualities head gardeners tend to have: their intelligence, their practicality, their modesty, their tans, their crinkly smiles, all of that. She's a big fan of gardeners, is Ambra. I was very impressed with the writing. It's occasionally florid, but I like that in some garden writing. She is a romantic through and through. You can see from her descriptions, and also the way that she hones in on love in the lives of the gardeners. I think at least 3 of them have openings where this rugged young man at the beginning of a determined and laser-focused career sees a girl and decides he has to have her. And that's an incidental part of the garden, but it's not. It's key to the way that Ambra sees these men and women as completely dedicated, and all of them are in different ways. I thought the book was absolutely marvellous, and it is a sort of potted history of gardening over the last 50 or so years, the way that these people got into the positions they have, some of them coming through apprenticeships and stints with the local park departments, some of them falling into it as career changers, some of them being classic, roly smoking drifters, some of them being homeless drug addicts. It's wonderful to see the ways that people come to find the connections with the places they end up in. For me, one of the most interesting stories in there was the one of Alistair Clark, the head gardener up at the Garden of Cosmic Speculation in Scotland. And I know the Garden of Cosmic Speculation by reputation and pictures alone. I know the images of the spirals of grass, those man-made mounds in sweeping lawn, and the strange concrete staircases that seem to have nothing to do with what many of us would regard as a garden. It's completely overlaid with this rather postmodern interpretative language, like the things you'd see next to an incomprehensible picture at the Tate Modern. What I didn't realise is that it's actually part of a much larger and more traditional estate, and that the head gardener has been head gardener there for over 50 years, joining when he was 15. And when he joined, it was a garden still run in Edwardian style. There's this wonderful quote where he talks about all the stuff that the gardeners would do, and I'm just going to read it to you now. Forgive me for not doing the Scottish accent. There were no power tools then. The only machine in the place was a 26-inch cylinder mower, recalls Alistair. I would walk 7.5 miles to cut the lawns. The banks were still cut with sheep shears, and the long grass with scythes. I'd make 22 birch brushes a year to sweep the leaves on the lawn, which we'd rot down for leaf mould and mix our own compost. We were completely self-sufficient. We made turf sacks, layering the turfs with lime and farmyard manure. We would collect dried cowpats in the winter, riddle them, and add them to the potting compost. We never fed anything in the growing season, and the plants were second to none. We would get gravel out of the river and riddle that too, saving the sharp sand for compost and spreading gravel around the house. This is a supremely old-fashioned method of gardening. And then suddenly the daughter of the incumbent owner, the person who was putting this young gardener to work doing this, inherits and marries a Californian architect who comes over here with the idea that he wants to build a garden demonstrating quantum theory, and he wants to do it by heaping an 80-foot tower of gravel up and then turfing over it. And the adaptable gardener says, okay, I will do it, and marks it out and measures it, and then becomes a world expert in this. Prior to that, he'd been growing hybrid begonias, 5,000 different cultivars. Suddenly, he is a world expert on landform art. I think it was a magnificent tale. I also like the sense of how gardens change, how stars rise and fall. Sissinghurst, I think, looms large over this book. A couple of gardeners see it in an antagonistic sense, almost. They see their missions as being the anti-Sissinghurst. So in a way, what was once the mecca of British horticulture has become something staid, something to fight against. And I wonder if we'll see that with any of the other gardens, particularly, I think, Great Dixter. The Fergus Garrett section, by the way, the head gardener of Great Dixter in this, is absolutely magnificent. And he comes across brilliantly, as he has when I've seen him lecture. And I think all the things he's doing is fantastic down there. But you see the momentum building around Great Dixter, the reputation spreading more and more. And I wonder if maybe they will find themselves with the Sissinghurst problem, the 4,000 visitors a Sunday, the trampled paths, the compaction, the everyone wanting to get a part of it. I should also mention that Charlie Hopkinson's pictures of Fergus Garrett are particularly brilliant because he's decided to photograph him often from behind as Fergus is running off to do some other urgent task, which I think captures the spirit of the man quite well. Anyway, so Sissinghurst looms large, and then you get to hear from Sissinghurst's head gardener, Troy Scott Smith, about how he feels this. He feels this himself and thinks that maybe it's time to have a bit of senescence back into the garden, to let areas fade, to do away with the tyranny of the straight line and the crisp edge a little bit. It's fascinating to see. The book is also very interesting for me from a professional perspective because it doesn't shy away from questions of money and budget and expectations. It addresses the problems of working for private individuals as well as the problems of working for publicly open gardens. I've worked for both. They have their own unique dilemmas, and Amber is very able to draw the accounts of these from the gardeners with brilliant clarity. The whole thing is written in a detached third person. The articles are obviously the result of fairly intensive face-to-face interviews, but Amber has removed herself completely from the narrative. There's no, I was overwhelmed as I walked through the garden gates. So I thoroughly recommend getting a copy of that book. It's quite expensive. The cover price is 35 quid. though you can buy new copies on Amazon for less than that. It's worth it, I think. The pictures are beautiful, there are good plant descriptions, the gardens are fantastic, and you will learn a good deal. So that's my recommendation for this week. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of The Garden Log. It was a warm one, and I am sitting in my study where the cool green walls don't actually reduce the temperature anything but psychologically. I therefore will now go and douse myself in cold water. I have one more bit of news for this week. It's good, happy news. I found out this week that I was accepted onto a garden history masters. The Masters in Garden and Landscape History at the School of Advanced Studies at the University of London. So I will be starting there 1 day a week from next September. So stay tuned for updates about what was going on in the garden 200 years ago. I hope you all managed to stay cool and that you enjoy whatever you do this week in the garden or outside of it. Thank you very much and goodbye.